She was nobody, a woman who smelled like old books and wore the same gray sweater every Sunday. Leaving her was the best decision I ever made. Ethan Carter said that into a live microphone at his own engagement party while Savannah laughed and the crowd cheered. He never imagined those words would be played back to him. In a palace, in front of 500 of the most powerful people in America, by the woman he just described. Because the nobody in the gray sweater, she was already standing behind the curtain, wearing a crown, and she had been waiting 3 years for exactly this night. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. There is a particular kind of man who mistakes cruelty for strength. He does not see it as cruelty, of course. He calls it ambition. He calls it evolution. He tells himself that the people he left behind simply could not keep up, that he outgrew them, the way a river outgrows its banks, naturally, inevitably, without apology. Ethan Carter was that kind of man, and on the night of December the 14th, standing at the iron gates of the Ashford Royal Estate in Washington, D.C., he was more convinced of his own greatness than he had ever been in his 41 years of life. The invitation in his hand was printed on cream-colored cardstock, so thick and heavy it felt almost like ivory. The gold lettering shimmered under the light of a dozen torches lining the palace entrance. He had turned it over 100 times in the past 2 weeks, running his thumb across the embossed seal of the Ashford dynasty, an eagle with its wings spread wide, gripping a single rose in one talon and a sword in the other. He did not know much about the Ashford family. Almost nobody did. That was precisely what made them powerful. They were old money in the truest sense, not the kind of wealth that posted vacation photos or attended charity galas for the publicity. They were the kind of wealth that owned the buildings where the galas were held, the kind that shaped markets without ever appearing in them. Rumor had it the Ashford Royal Trust held controlling stakes in 11 Fortune 500 companies. Rumor had it the family had advised 3 American presidents quietly from rooms that never appeared in official photographs. And now Ethan Carter, the son of a Cleveland electrician, had been invited inside. He exhaled slowly and glanced at Savannah. She was beautiful, the way expensive things are beautiful, polished, symmetrical, deliberately assembled. Her dress was crimson and backless, the kind of gown that was designed to make every person in the room look at her the moment she entered. Her dark hair was pinned up with a diamond clip that Ethan had charged to his corporate expense account without telling her. She was 24 years old and had 400,000 social media followers who watched her document every restaurant, every rooftop, every first-class flight, as though the life she was living had always belonged to her. "Stop fidgeting," she said, adjusting the collar of his tuxedo without looking at his face. "You look nervous." "I'm not nervous. You've checked your watch 6 times since we got out of the car. I'm just—" He stopped. "I want tonight to go perfectly." She smiled and tucked her hand into the crook of his elbow. "It will. We look incredible." She pulled out her phone with her free hand, held it up, and snapped a photo of the 2 of them standing before the gates. "The comments are going to explode," she murmured, already uploading it. Ethan watched her and thought not for the first time that she was exactly the kind of woman he had always wanted. Not because of who she was, but because of what she represented. She was proof. Proof that he had arrived, that the years of grinding and maneuvering and climbing had been worth something, that he had never been the forgettable middle-class boy from Ohio that certain people had tried to convince him he was. Certain people. He did not let himself say the name. Not tonight. The gates opened. The sound of an orchestra drifted out from somewhere deep inside the palace, something classical and sweeping that Ethan recognized vaguely as Debussy, without being able to name the specific piece. The entrance hall was vast marble floors, the color of pale bone ceilings that seemed to disappear into shadow above massive crystal chandeliers. Uniformed attendants moved through the space like chess pieces, precise and unhurried, carrying flutes of champagne on silver trays. Ethan took a glass without breaking stride and told himself he belonged here. He had been telling himself that for 20 years. He was very good at it. The crowd inside was unlike any he had been in before. He had attended Wall Street parties. He had been to Manhattan galas where tickets cost $10,000 a plate, and senators circulated through the room making small talk about offshore accounts and regulatory frameworks. He had shaken hands with men whose names appeared on buildings. He thought he understood power. He understood nothing. The people in this room moved differently. They spoke differently. There was no performance of wealth here. No one was trying to impress anyone. The men wore tuxedos that were not ostentatious, but were clearly worth more than most people's monthly salaries. The women wore jewelry that did not sparkle aggressively, but caught the light in a way that suggested permanence heritage weight. These were people whose families had held the same land for 150 years, people who did not need to announce themselves because the rooms they entered already knew their names. Ethan felt it immediately, the slight shift in his confidence, the almost imperceptible tightening in his chest. Savannah did not feel it. She was already scanning the room for interesting backdrops. "Oh my God," she whispered, tugging his arm. "Is that Senator Hargrove?" "Yes," Ethan said, recognizing the man near the fireplace. "Can we get a photo with him?" "Savannah. Just one. It would be incredible for my feed." "We are not approaching a United States senator to ask for a photo for your social media." She pouted briefly, then recovered. "Fine, but if he comes to us, I'm asking." Ethan spotted his business associate Marcus Webb near the far end of the room and moved toward him with purpose, grateful for a familiar face. Marcus was 62, a semi-retired investment strategist who had been in the industry longer than Ethan had been alive. He had been Ethan's mentor for the first 4 years of his career. He was also one of the most well-connected men in East Coast finance. "Marcus," Ethan said, extending his hand. Marcus shook it, but something about the way he looked at Ethan was different. Careful, measured. "Ethan, you made it." "Of course. You know I never miss an opportunity like this." He gestured at the room with his glass. "You know the Ashford family well." "I know of them," Marcus said quietly. "Everyone does. You don't know them personally until they allow it. What do you know about the Queen the host?" Marcus looked at him for a moment, just a moment, but long enough for Ethan to notice. "I know she's not someone you want to underestimate," he said carefully. "Mysterious," Ethan said, smiling. "That's one word for it." Before Ethan could ask more, a low, resonant tone sounded through the ballroom, a single note from somewhere above, and the orchestra faded into silence. The effect was instant and total. Every conversation in the room ceased. Every glass was lowered. Every face turned toward the grand staircase at the far end of the hall. The lights above the staircase shifted, not dimmed, but softened the way light changes at dusk, golden and expectant. And then she appeared at the top of the stairs. Ethan's first impression was that she was still. Not frozen, not posed. Still the way things are still that have no need to move, no need to demand attention because attention comes to them without effort. She wore white. Not bridal white, but the white of winter of clean paper of the first snow before anyone has walked through it. Her gown was simple in the way that only genuinely expensive things can be. Simple, not a single unnecessary detail, not a seam out of place. Her hair was dark and pulled back at the nape of her neck. No crown, no tiara. No visible jewelry, except for a single strand of pearls. She descended the staircase, and the room moved with her. Senators inclined their heads. Billionaires stepped back to create a natural path. A decorated military general, a man with more medals than Ethan could count, actually gave a small bow as she passed. Ethan watched it all with something he did not immediately identify as unease. And then she turned, and he saw her face. The glass in his hand dropped 3 inches before he caught it. He had not moved. He had not made a sound. But inside his chest, something shifted with such violent force that for a moment he genuinely could not breathe. Because the woman descending that staircase, the woman before whom senators bowed and generals lowered their eyes, was Eleanor. His Eleanor. Eleanor Hayes, his ex-wife. The quiet, soft-spoken woman he had divorced 3 years ago. The woman who wore simple cotton sweaters and spent her weekends restoring damaged pages of 19th century poetry in a small Boston library that smelled of old paper and paste. The woman he had called boring in front of his friends. The woman he had said had no ambition, no spark, no understanding of what real life looked like. The woman he had left for someone younger and louder and more willing to perform happiness for an audience. She was standing at the top of the most powerful staircase in Washington, D.C., and she looked like she had been born there. Ethan tried to speak. His mouth formed words, but none of them had any sound. Savannah leaned close to him. "Who is she?" "She's stunning." He could not answer. Eleanor reached the base of the staircase. She paused, and then across 50 feet of marble floor and 100 chattering conversations, she found him. Their eyes met, and Eleanor Hayes smiled. Not warmly, not coldly. It was something more complicated and more ancient than either of those things. It was the smile of someone who had always known this moment would come and had simply been patient enough to let it arrive. She said nothing. Not yet. She turned back to her guests, accepted a flute of champagne from a waiting attendant, and began moving through the room with the ease of someone who had never in her life been uncertain of where she belonged. Ethan stood completely still. Marcus appeared beside him. "You've gone white," he said quietly. "I know her." A pause. "I know," Marcus said. Ethan turned to look at him sharply. You knew she was... I told you not to underestimate her." Marcus took a slow sip of his drink. "I said it as gently as I could." Savannah, oblivious to all of it, was already pulling at Ethan's arm. "Come on, there's a photographer over there doing portraits. Let's go before there's a line." "Savannah." His voice came out sharper than he intended. She blinked at him, surprised. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." He straightened his spine, forced himself back into his body. "Nothing is wrong. Stay close to me." He moved through the room toward the bar, needing something to do with his hands, needing a moment to think. His mind was running calculations he couldn't quite complete. Eleanor Hayes, the woman who had spent their entire 3-year marriage quietly apologizing for taking up space, was the queen of the Ashford dynasty. That was not possible. That was not it, defied every piece of evidence he had ever gathered about her. She had been ordinary. That had been the entire problem. That had been the thing he could not forgive. The ordinary sweaters, the ordinary job, the ordinary Friday nights with tea and library books and public radio playing softly in the kitchen. He had grown up poor and fought his way to something better, and he needed a life that reflected that, a life that looked like success from the outside, a life that announced itself, a life that no one could mistake for average. Eleanor had never cared about any of that. That was what he had called boring. That was what he had said was the fundamental incompatibility between them. He reached the bar and ordered a whiskey neat and drank half of it before he remembered that he was supposed to be enjoying himself tonight. A hand touched his arm. He turned. Eleanor stood beside him close enough that he could smell the faint trace of something floral, jasmine maybe, or something older and more expensive than jasmine. Her eyes were the same as he remembered. Dark brown, quiet, watchful. The kind of eyes that noticed things without appearing to. "Ethan," she said. Not a question, not an exclamation, just his name offered back to him like something she had been holding for a while. "Eleanor." His voice was almost steady. "I didn't know that I was the host." She tilted her head slightly. "No, I imagine you didn't." "How is this? I mean, when did you—" "Some things take time to arrange," she said simply. "Some things take exactly as long as they need to." She glanced past him toward where Savannah was now introducing herself to a cluster of women near the portrait station. "You brought someone." "Yes." He couldn't think of anything to add. "She's lovely." Her tone was completely neutral. "Please enjoy the evening, Ethan. We'll have a chance to talk properly later." She began to move away, then stopped as though she had just remembered something small and unimportant. "Oh, and welcome to my home." She walked away. Ethan stood at the bar and felt for the first time in years that he had said entirely the wrong thing. The next hour was the longest of his life. He circulated through the room with Savannah, shaking hands, exchanging business pleasantries, performing the version of himself that played well at events like this. But underneath every conversation, something was disintegrating. He kept tracking Eleanor's position in the room, the way you track a storm on the horizon, unable to look away, unable to predict exactly where it would land. She was different in this space, not different from the woman he remembered. Still quiet, still unhurried, but different in the way that a river is different when you see it from the right angle, when you understand for the first time that what you thought was gentleness was actually depth. People gravitated toward her, not because she demanded it, but because she radiated something that made people feel that being near her was the most important place to be. He watched her speak with a senator for 3 minutes and watched the senator laugh genuinely, not the political laugh, but the real one. He watched her exchange a few words with a man he recognized from the cover of Forbes magazine and watched the man nod with the kind of seriousness that meant he was receiving information he needed. And everywhere Eleanor went, her eyes occasionally, briefly, without expression, found his. At 9:15, a soft bell announced dinner. The crowd moved toward the dining room, which was a cathedral of a space 40 feet of table set with china so fine it looked like it might shatter from a raised voice. The seating arrangement was already decided. Ethan found his place card. He was 7 seats from Eleanor, close enough to be within her orbit, far enough to feel the distance. Savannah slipped into the seat beside him, pressed her knee against his, and leaned in. "Okay, I need you to tell me who that woman is. The queen or whatever. I've been asking around and no one will say anything specific." "Her name is Eleanor," Ethan said. Savannah stared at him. "Wait, Eleanor? You're Eleanor." "She's not my Eleanor." "The librarian, the one you said was—" She stopped, looked again at the head of the table where Eleanor was being seated. "That's her." "Yes." Savannah was quiet for 3 full seconds, which was a long time for her. "Ethan," she said carefully, "why didn't you tell me your ex-wife was—" "I didn't know. You didn't know your own ex-wife was a queen. Savannah, please lower your voice." She lowered her voice, but not her expression, which had shifted into something calculating and unsettled. "This is insane," she whispered. "She was a librarian." "She worked in a library," he corrected himself automatically, uselessly. "She was restoring books." "Ethan, she owns a palace." He picked up his fork. Across the table, a man he didn't recognize leaned toward him with the particular ease of someone who already knew exactly what was happening. "First time at Ashford?" the man asked pleasantly. "Yes," Ethan said. "Memorable place for a first visit." The man smiled in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Queen Eleanor tends to make an impression." "She does," Ethan said neutrally. "You two are acquainted?" He paused. "We've met." The man nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, as though Ethan had confirmed something he had already been told. "I imagine you have." The first course arrived, a pale soup with truffles shaved over it, delicate as paper. Ethan lifted his spoon and told himself to breathe. And then Eleanor picked up her wine glass, turned to the room, and said in a clear, carrying voice, "Before we begin, I'd like to offer a particular welcome to one of our newer guests, someone who's come a very long way in more ways than one." Every head at the table turned. She was looking directly at Ethan. "Welcome, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice perfectly modulated, carrying warmth and something else, something precise beneath the warmth, like a blade inside silk. "I have been looking forward to this evening for quite some time." The room offered a polite murmur of acknowledgement. To anyone who didn't know, it sounded like graciousness, like hospitality. Ethan understood that it was none of those things. He raised his glass in response because he had no other option and tried to smile, and understood with absolute clarity for the first time in the evening that he had walked into something he was not equipped to walk out of. Savannah was gripping his arm under the table with her fingers pressing hard into his jacket. He did not look at her. He looked at Eleanor. And Eleanor, with the serenity of someone who had already won every game that mattered, simply turned back to her soup and began to eat. The orchestra started again, softly, somewhere beyond the walls. And somewhere in the back of Ethan Carter's mind, the first brick in the wall he had spent 20 years building, quietly, inexorably, came loose. He just didn't know yet how many bricks there were. He just didn't know yet how fast they were about to fall. The soup course ended, the plates were cleared, and Ethan Carter sat at that long, gleaming table telling himself he was still in control of the situation. He was not. He could feel it, the way you feel a change in weather before the rain actually arrives. Something in the air, something in the quality of silence between the words people were saying to him. The man across from him, whose name he had already forgotten, kept watching him with that same mild, knowing smile. The woman 2 seats down from Savannah had introduced herself as Lady Haverfield and then proceeded to ignore both of them completely, which in this room Ethan was beginning to understand was its own form of communication. Savannah leaned close. "She keeps looking at you," she murmured. "Don't stare back." "I'm not staring, I'm observing. There's a difference." She picked up her wine glass and held it in a way she had clearly practiced to look casual. "She's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I don't know." "Someone bitter, someone who looked like she lost." She paused. "She doesn't look like she lost anything." Ethan said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that. He had spent 3 years constructing a narrative in which Eleanor was the one left behind, in which he was the one who moved forward, who grew, who chose life over stagnation. It was a narrative he had told so many times to his friends, to his colleagues. To Savannah on their second date, when she had asked about his marriage with the particular curiosity of someone who wanted to understand what she was getting into, that he had stopped recognizing it as a story and started experiencing it as history. Eleanor had been quiet. Eleanor had been content with small things. Eleanor had never wanted more than her books and her library and her tea and her radio programs and her narrow, considered life. And he had wanted the world. That was all it was. That was the whole story. Except that across the table, the Queen of the Ashford dynasty was listening to a foreign ambassador tell what appeared to be a very long joke, and she was laughing genuinely fully with her whole face, and she looked more alive than anyone Ethan had ever seen in any room he had ever been in. He cut his beef and put it in his mouth and tasted nothing. 40 minutes into dinner, Marcus Webb leaned across the empty seat between them and spoke in a voice low enough that only Ethan could hear. "There's going to be a private gathering after dinner, in the East Wing. A few key people. You've been included on the list." "Who included me?" Marcus looked at him steadily. "Who do you think—" Ethan set down his knife. "Why?" "That's a question you're going to have to ask her yourself." Savannah caught the exchange and immediately wanted to know what it was about. Ethan told her it was a business conversation and watched her decide after a moment of visible calculation to accept that answer. She turned back to her phone, which she had been checking under the table every 4 minutes, despite having no signal strong enough to post anything. The isolation was clearly bothering her more than she wanted to admit. This room did not care about her followers. This room had never heard of her, and in the specific language of status that Savannah spoke fluently, that was the loudest possible insult. "I feel like everyone here is in on something," she said quietly. "They probably are," Ethan said. "Old money always is." "That's not comforting." "It wasn't meant to be." She looked at him sharply. He realized he had said it with more edge than he intended and softened his expression. "I just mean, these people have known each other for decades. We're newcomers. It takes time." She nodded slowly, but her eyes moved back to Eleanor. "Did she know we were coming?" Savannah asked. The question landed in the space between them with the weight of something much larger than its 4 words. "Yes," Ethan said. "I think she did." Savannah opened her mouth and then closed it again. For once, she did not fill the silence with words. Dinner concluded at 10:45. The guests dispersed into smaller currents, some toward the main ballroom where the orchestra had resumed, some toward the smoking room, some toward the garden despite the cold. Ethan followed Marcus through a set of unmarked doors at the far end of the dining room, down a corridor lined with portraits he did not have time to examine, and into a room that was warm and book-lined and smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. The smell hit him first. Before he had even registered the room, before he had counted the people in it, the smell reached him, and something in his chest moved without permission. Because Eleanor's library in their Boston apartment had smelled exactly like this. He had complained about it once, told her the books made the whole place feel like a museum, like somewhere people came to look and not to live. She had smiled and said nothing, and the books had stayed. He had forgotten that smell entirely until this exact moment. There were 8 people in the room. Marcus was one. Ethan recognized 2 others from the dinner table, the Forbes man, and a woman he had identified during the meal as a federal judge. The remaining 4 he did not know. All of them had the particular ease of people who were accustomed to being in rooms where decisions were made. Eleanor stood near the fireplace. She had changed nothing about herself. Same white gown, same single strand of pearls, same stillness. But without the audience of 500 people around her, the effect was different, more concentrated. She filled the room not with volume, but with presence, the way a single candle fills a small space more completely than a dozen lamps fill a large one. "Thank you all for joining me," she said. Her voice was the same voice he remembered from 7 years of shared mornings. He had once found it soothing. Tonight it moved through him like cold water. "I want to speak plainly, because the people in this room appreciate plainness." She let her gaze move around the group and land finally on Ethan. "There are things that need to be said before the evening continues." The Forbes man whose name Ethan had finally learned was Gerald Ashton spoke first. "Eleanor, before you proceed, does Mr. Carter understand the full context of tonight?" "Not yet," Eleanor said. "Then perhaps—" "I'll take care of it, Gerald." Her tone was gentle. It was not a suggestion. Gerald Ashton, a man worth approximately $4 billion, nodded and said nothing further. Eleanor crossed the room and stood before Ethan with 2 feet of space between them. Up close in the firelight, he could see things that the distance of the dinner table had hidden. There were 3 years in her face that hadn't been there before, not age exactly, but depth. The kind of depth that only comes from living through something significant and choosing deliberately not to be diminished by it. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I want you to listen completely before you respond. Can you do that?" "Yes," he said. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds, long enough to establish that she was deciding whether to believe him. "Good," she said, and then she told him. The Ashford dynasty was Eleanor's maternal inheritance, a lineage of quiet, deliberate power that had been building in America for 170 years. Her mother had kept it from the public for the entirety of Eleanor's childhood, not out of shame, but out of strategy. The family's influence depended on discretion. It depended on the ability to operate without being watched. The moment the Ashford name became celebrity news, it would become a different kind of thing, entirely visible, vulnerable, available for public consumption. Her mother had protected against that with the same discipline with which she protected everything she valued. Eleanor had grown up knowing who she was. She had simply also known that who she was existed separately from who she appeared to be. When she had taken the job at the Boston Library, her first year after graduate school, her first year in a city where no one knew her face, it had been a deliberate choice. She loved books. She loved the silence of careful work. She loved the way a damaged page given enough time and the right tools could be made whole again. She had not been pretending to be ordinary. She had been choosing in the limited way that people with her responsibilities could choose, to live as a person rather than as a symbol. And then she had met Ethan. She paused here. Ethan felt the pause like a hand pressing against his chest. "I loved you," she said, simply without drama, the way you state a fact about the physical world. "I want you to understand that because what I'm about to tell you is not about revenge. It's about truth. And it's easier to understand the truth when you know that it comes from someone who is not your enemy." "Eleanor, I haven't finished." He closed his mouth. When their marriage began unraveling, when Ethan started staying later at the office, started coming home with a particular restlessness, started looking at her across the dinner table with an expression she recognized as dissatisfaction, Eleanor had made a choice. Not to fight for the marriage in the way she had seen women fight, with pleading and ultimatums and performances of need, but to do what she always did with things that mattered. She paid attention. She watched. She waited. And while she waited, she made some phone calls. Quiet ones. Through channels that had nothing to do with the Boston Library or the life she and Ethan shared on the surface. The Ashford Royal Trust had, through a series of carefully constructed intermediary companies, made a series of investments in the mid-tier investment firm where Ethan worked. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible, just precisely enough to stabilize the company during a difficult quarter, which stabilized Ethan's position, which enabled the promotion that he believed was the result of his own brilliance and determination. Ethan listened to this and felt something cold beginning to spread through his body from the center outward. You're saying, he said slowly, that you funded my career. I'm saying the trust made investments that benefited you, yes. While we were still married. Yes. Why? She looked at him with something that was not quite pity and not quite sadness, but contained elements of both. Because I loved you, she said. And you needed it. And I could provide it. That is what people do for the people they love, Ethan. They use what they have. He turned away from her, faced the fire, stared into it. Gerald Ashton, from somewhere behind him, cleared his throat quietly. The federal judge said nothing. Marcus said nothing. The room held its breath. After the divorce, Eleanor continued addressing his back. The trust continued the investments, not out of love at that point, out of, she considered her word, interest. The company was performing well, and I had become, through the normal processes of acquisition and transition, a controlling stakeholder. Ethan turned around. You own the company, he said. Yes. You own the firm I work for. Yes. Since when? 14 months ago. The number landed like a physical blow. 14 months. He had been operating for 14 months, attending board meetings, presenting quarterly projections, making hiring decisions, flying to conferences, and shaking hands, and presenting himself as a man at the height of his powers inside a company that his ex-wife owned. Does anyone else know? His voice had changed. Something had gone out of it. The board knows, Eleanor said. They've known since the acquisition. They were... She paused, and he could have sworn the corner of her mouth moved almost imperceptibly, instructed to allow normal operations to continue. Instructed, he repeated. Yes. He looked at the people in the room. The Forbes man, the judge, the 4 others. They were all watching him with expressions that ranged from neutral to carefully sympathetic. Not a single face showed surprise. They had all known this before he walked in. This entire gathering, this specific audience, had been assembled to watch this exact moment. You planned this, he said. Tonight, all of it. I planned to tell you the truth, Eleanor said. I chose to do it here, yes, in a place where the conversation would be witnessed. Why? Why witnesses? Because the last time we had an important conversation, she said, and her voice remained absolutely steady. You told me afterward that it had never happened. The room went very quiet. Ethan remembered the conversation she meant. The night 2 months before the divorce was finalized, when he had told her that she was the problem in their marriage, that her contentment, her refusal to want more, to push harder to match his energy, had been dragging him down for years. He had been loud. He had said things he had never said before, and several he had never fully acknowledged, saying afterward. He had told her she was forgettable. He had said it deliberately, with the specific cruelty of someone who wants to hurt, because they feel guilty, and guilt in people like Ethan has a way of converting itself into attack. He had never apologized for that conversation. He had told himself afterward that it hadn't been as bad as it seemed, that she was being dramatic, that she had misremembered his words. She had not misremembered a single one. He could see that now in the way she was looking at him. She had held every word exactly as he had said it for 3 years, without anger, without bitterness, with the simple, terrible clarity of someone who does not need to exaggerate the truth, because the truth on its own is already enough. I need some air, he said. Of course. Eleanor stepped aside. He walked to the door. His hand was on the handle when she spoke again, quietly, to the room in general, or perhaps to no one in particular. He always needed air, she said, whenever a room got too honest. He heard Gerald Ashton exhale, not a laugh exactly, but something adjacent to one. Ethan walked out into the corridor and leaned against the wall and stayed there for 60 seconds, with his eyes closed, breathing. His phone vibrated. Savannah. He looked at the message. Where are you? People are asking questions. I feel like an idiot standing here alone. He typed back 5 minutes. Stay put. He put the phone in his pocket and stared at the ceiling. The portrait at the far end of the corridor was of a woman in a gray dress from what looked like the 19th century. She had dark eyes and a particular quality of stillness that was familiar to him in a way he did not want to examine. He walked back toward the main ballroom. He needed to find Savannah. He needed to find a version of this evening that he could still manage. He turned a corner and nearly walked directly into Marcus. "How much did you know?" Ethan asked. No preamble, no setup. Marcus looked at him evenly. "Enough." "Did she approach you, Eleanor?" "She didn't have to. I've known the Ashford family for 11 years. When I saw your name on the guest list, I understood what the evening would involve. And you didn't warn me." "I told you not to underestimate her." Marcus's voice was not unkind. That was as much warning as I could give without betraying a confidence. He paused. "And frankly, Ethan, you wouldn't have listened to more than that. You never do." Ethan opened his mouth, closed it. Because it was true. He knew it was true. He had built his entire career on not listening to people who told him he was wrong. "What happens now?" he asked. "That," Marcus said quietly, "depends entirely on you." He straightened his jacket. "Eleanor is not a vindictive woman. She never has been. But she is precise, and she has arranged this evening with great precision. The question is what you choose to do inside the structure she's built." He walked away, leaving Ethan alone in the corridor. Back in the ballroom, Savannah found him before he found her. She appeared at his elbow with her jaw set and her eyes bright with the specific expression she wore when she was upset and trying to conceal it by leaning into aggression. "People have been asking me things," she said. "What kind of things?" "About you. About her. About your marriage." She lowered her voice, but not her intensity. "One woman lady, something I didn't catch her last name, told me that I should consider my position carefully." "What does that mean?" "What does that mean, Ethan?" "It means old money likes to be theatrical. This does not feel theatrical. This feels like a trap." He looked at her and thought not for the first time that evening that she was smarter than he gave her credit for. She felt the architecture of the night, even if she didn't have the context to name it. "Stay by my side," he said. "Don't answer questions about us. Don't talk about Eleanor. Don't—" He hesitated. "Don't post anything tonight." Savannah stared at him. "Don't post anything, Ethan. I've been documenting our—" "Savannah." He held her gaze. "Please." Something in his expression reached her. She nodded slowly, and for the first time since they'd arrived, she put her phone completely away. They moved through the ballroom together. The orchestra was playing something Ethan recognized without being able to name. Around them, the room's conversations continued in low, elegant tones, but he could feel the shift, the slight, barely perceptible shift, in the way certain people looked at him now, not with hostility, with knowledge, the way a room full of people look at someone when they have all been told the same true thing about them. At 11:30, Eleanor took the floor. Not the dance floor, the center of the room. She simply moved to it, and the room accommodated her the way water accommodates a stone, not by parting dramatically, but by adjusting naturally without effort. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight," she said. "This gala has been many things over the years, a celebration, a gathering, a place where old friendships are honored and new ones are made." She paused. "Tonight it is also something else. Tonight it is a moment of honesty." Ethan went still. Savannah's hand tightened on his arm. "There is a man in this room," Eleanor said, "who believes that success is something you build alone, that the people around you are either assets or liabilities, that love is a transaction, and that the past can be discarded when it stops being convenient." She let the silence hold for 2 full beats. "I used to know that man very well." Every head in the room had turned. Every eye moved between Eleanor and Ethan with the unhurried interest of people watching something they had been told in advance would be worth watching. Ethan did not move. "I am not here to humiliate anyone," Eleanor said. "I am here to say something simple, something that I have wanted to say for 3 years in a room full of people who understand what it means." She looked at him then, directly, without flinching. "You were loved, Ethan. Genuinely, completely, by someone who had everything she could have wanted and chose you anyway. And that was not weakness. That was the most powerful thing anyone in this room has ever offered you." The room was absolutely silent. "I hope," she said quietly, "that someday you understand the difference between the life you wanted and the life you had." She turned back to her guests. "Now I believe it's time for dancing. The orchestra has been far too patient." The room exhaled. The music resumed, and Ethan Carter stood in the middle of the most elegant room he had ever entered and felt with total and devastating clarity that he was the smallest person in it. Savannah said nothing. For once in the entire evening, she had absolutely nothing to say. And somewhere across the marble floor, Eleanor Hayes accepted an invitation to dance from the federal judge and moved through the room with the ease of someone who had already finished the most important conversation of her evening. She did not look back. The music had been playing for 11 minutes before Ethan moved. He stood exactly where Eleanor had left him in the center of the ballroom with 500 people circulating around him like water around a rock, and he made himself breathe. In, out, slow. The way his father had taught him to breathe before a difficult conversation back when he was 12 years old, and his father was still someone whose advice he took. Savannah had not spoken since Eleanor's address to the room. That alone told him how serious the situation was. Savannah filled silence the way weather fills space, automatically, completely, without apparent effort. Her silence now was not peaceful. It was the silence of someone recalculating. He needed to do something. Standing still was not an option. Standing still in a room where everyone had just watched you be publicly, precisely, and without cruelty dismantled was its own kind of surrender. He straightened his jacket. He picked up a fresh glass of champagne from a passing tray. He turned to Savannah and said with as much steadiness as he could manufacture, "Let's dance." She looked at him. "You want to dance?" "Yes. Right now." Right now. She studied his face for a moment with those sharp, assessing eyes that he had always underestimated. Then she put her hand in his and let him lead her to the floor. It was the right move tactically. It was what his instincts told him to do. Keep moving, keep performing. Refuse to let the room see you wounded. He had been doing that his entire life, moving forward before anyone could see the damage. It had worked for 20 years. He was about to find out how far 20 years of practice actually carried a man. They danced. He kept his posture straight and his expression neutral, and guided Savannah through the steps with enough competence that they did not embarrass themselves. Around them, other couples moved. The orchestra played something in three-quarter time. And across the room, Ethan tracked Eleanor with his peripheral vision, the way you track something dangerous, not because you want to provoke it, but because losing sight of it would be worse. She was dancing with a man he didn't recognize. Tall, silver-haired European, in the specific way that certain men are European, the posture, the cut of the suit, something in the way he held himself that suggested he had grown up being told he mattered. Eleanor was speaking to him, and whatever she was saying made him laugh with his whole chest. She looked, Ethan thought, genuinely happy. Not performatively, not strategically, just happy, present. Entirely untroubled by the fact that she had just detonated a small explosion in the center of the room. "She's watching you," Savannah said quietly. "No, she isn't." She glanced over twice in the last 30 seconds. "You counted." "I notice things." Savannah's voice was flat. "It's what I do." She paused, and then said what she had clearly been building toward since Eleanor's speech ended. "Did you love her?" The question was so direct that it almost made him miss a step. "We were married for 3 years," he said. "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. Her face was composed, but her eyes were doing something complicated. "I thought I did," he said finally, "at the time. And now is very different from then." She absorbed this, nodded once, then said very quietly, "I don't think I've ever heard you talk about her the way she just talked about you." He didn't answer. There was no answer to that which would serve him in any direction. The song ended. He released her hand, and they separated with the particular politeness of two people who needed distance from each other before they said something that couldn't be unsaid. It was 12 minutes past midnight. Marcus found him near the East Terrace doors, which had been opened despite the cold to allow a few guests outside with their cigars and private conversations. Ethan had positioned himself at the boundary inside, enough to stay warm close enough to the opening that he could breathe air that didn't feel like it belonged to someone else. "There's a card game starting," Marcus said without preamble. "Poker. Private room, East Wing. The stakes are significant." Ethan looked at him. "Eleanor's idea. Eleanor's room, Eleanor's table, Eleanor's game." Marcus held his gaze. "You don't have to play." "What happens if I don't?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Nothing dramatic. You stand in this room for another hour, and then you go home. Life continues." He paused. "But certain conversations that might happen at that table won't happen any other way." "What conversations?" "About your position at the company, about what the next quarter looks like, about whether certain decisions that have already been made can be revisited." Ethan understood immediately. This was the real meeting. The ballroom and the speech and the dinner had all been the opening act. The poker table was where the actual business was going to happen. Eleanor had set the board. Now she was inviting him to play. "Who else is at the table?" he asked. "Gerald Ashton, the Hargrove senator, a woman named Diana Cho, she runs the trust's legal division, and Eleanor." 5 players, a federal senator, a $4 billion investor, the chief legal officer of the Ashford Trust, and his ex-wife, who apparently owned his company, and him. "What are the buy-in stakes?" he asked. Marcus named a number. Ethan absorbed it. It was large. Not catastrophically large for him. He had the liquidity barely, but large enough that losing would require an explanation he did not want to give. "I'll play," he said. Marcus nodded once as though he had expected no other answer. 20 minutes. I'll have someone come for you." He walked back through the ballroom. Savannah was at the bar talking to a young woman in a blue dress who appeared to be interviewing her, asking questions, leaning in, nodding, with the specific attentiveness of someone gathering information rather than enjoying conversation. Ethan changed direction immediately and reached them in 12 steps. "Savannah," he touched her elbow. "Can I borrow you for a moment?" The woman in the blue dress smiled pleasantly. "Of course. We were just getting acquainted." She extended a hand to Ethan. "Margot Delacroix. I write for the Continental Review." A journalist. At Eleanor's table. Ethan shook the hand with practiced smoothness. "Ethan Carter. Lovely to meet you." "And you?" "Savannah was just telling me about your engagement. Congratulations to you both." "Thank you." He smiled. He moved Savannah away with the light pressure of one hand at the small of her back, not urgently enough to look like flight, just firmly enough to accomplish it. When they were clear, Savannah turned to him with bright, slightly alarmed eyes. "She's a journalist." "I know. She asked me about the engagement, and she asked about Eleanor. She knew your history. She knew about the divorce. She asked me how it felt to attend an event hosted by your fiancé's ex-wife." Her voice was controlled, but her hands were not one of them pressing flat against her collarbone, in a gesture he recognized as her, tells for genuine anxiety. "Ethan, this is not just a gala." "I know," he said again. "What is it?" He looked at her and decided for the first time all evening to give her a straight answer. "It's a reckoning," he said. "Eleanor has arranged this entire evening to make a specific point, to the right people, in the right room, with the right witnesses." Savannah stared at him. "About you? About me?" She was quiet. Then, "What did you do to her?" The question hit differently than she probably intended, not accusatory, genuinely asking, trying to build the map of the territory she had walked into without a guide. "I left her," he said, "and I wasn't—" He stopped, started again. "I wasn't kind about it." "How unkind?" "Savannah, I need to know. Whatever is happening tonight, I am in it with you, and I need to understand what I am defending." He looked at her for a long moment. She was 24 years old, and she had 400,000 followers who watched her life like a television show, and she had never in the 2 years he had known her asked him a question that required him to be honest about something he was ashamed of. This was the first time. "I told her she was forgettable," he said, "in front of people." Savannah did not blink. "Was she?" "No," he said. And his voice, to his own surprise, came out completely without defenses. "She was the least forgettable person I have ever known. I just didn't understand that until—" He glanced across the room to where Eleanor was now moving through the crowd, again unhurried, luminous, entirely her own, until tonight. Savannah followed his gaze. She looked at Eleanor for a long moment, then she looked back at him, and in her eyes something shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but the way things shift in the morning when the light changes and you can suddenly see clearly what was blurry before. She said nothing, but she removed her hand from his arm, slowly, without making a scene of it, just removed it. And that small gesture said more than either of them was ready to name. An attendant appeared at Ethan's elbow. "Mr. Carter, the room is ready for you." He followed without looking back at Savannah. The poker room was smaller than he expected. A round table, 6 chairs, soft light overhead, a bar cart in the corner. Gerald Ashton was already seated shuffling a deck with the practiced ease of a man who had played cards in rooms like this for decades. Senator Hargrove sat across from him jacketless, his tie loosened, looking entirely more comfortable than he had at dinner. Diana Cho sat with her hands folded on the table, a glass of water in front of her. No alcohol, Ethan noted. The legal mind staying sharp, one chair remained empty, Eleanor's. They greeted him pleasantly, not warmly pleasantly, the way people greet someone they have been told they will be meeting and have prepared accordingly. Ethan sat. He accepted a glass of scotch. He folded his hands on the table and breathed through the tight feeling in his chest. Eleanor entered 3 minutes later. She had changed. Not dramatically, the white gown replaced by something simpler, dark, still elegant, but without the formality of the ballroom. She sat in the remaining chair, accepted the deck from Gerald, and said, 5-card draw. The first person out of chips loses. We play until someone wins. She looked around the table, meeting each set of eyes in turn. And we talk while we play. That is the agreement. Senator Hargrove smiled, as it's always been. Eleanor dealt. For the first 30 minutes, the conversation around the table was general. Industry markets, a legislative amendment that Diana Cho had apparently been following with professional interest. Ethan played carefully, conservatively, bleeding chips slowly, rather than risking anything large. He won 2 small hands and lost 1 medium one. He was holding his own. He was also listening. With every layer of his attention he was listening, because the conversation around this table was not idle. These people spoke in a particular code, nothing stated directly. Everything implied the real meaning carried not in the words themselves, but in what surrounded them, the pauses, the glances, the subtle redirections. He had spent 15 years learning to read rooms like this. He applied every skill he had. At 12:45, Gerald Ashton placed a significant bet and said almost as an aside, "The Meredith acquisition didn't go the way anyone expected, of course." Ethan's hands stilled almost imperceptibly over his cards. The Meredith acquisition, 6 months ago, the biggest deal of his career. He had led the negotiations personally, and it had been by every visible metric a triumph. His board had celebrated. His name had appeared in 3 financial publications. He had been so proud of that deal he had framed the press coverage and put it in his office. "No," Diana Cho agreed mildly. "It did not." "Ethan," Eleanor said, addressing him directly for the first time since they'd sat down, "you led that negotiation." "I did," he said. "Tell me what was your read on the Meredith board, their primary motivation?" He answered. Smoothly, confidently, the way he had answered 100 board questions: expansion, market share, a tax structure that benefited the acquisition timeline. Eleanor listened, nodded, then said, the Meredith board's primary motivation was debt relief. Specifically, they were carrying $17 million in undisclosed liability on 2 legacy properties in Maryland. The expansion narrative was what their communications team put forward. The actual driver was survival. She picked up her cards, considered them. The trust's analysts identified it in the 2nd week of due diligence. The room was quiet. "The acquisition still succeeded," Ethan said carefully. "It did," Eleanor agreed. "At a price point 15% higher than necessary, because the negotiating team, your team, didn't know what the seller actually needed." She looked at her cards again. "If you'd known about the Maryland properties, you could have structured the deal differently, saved the company significantly." Ethan absorbed this. "How do you know the trust's analysts identified it?" Eleanor looked up from her cards. "Because I read the report." Another pause. "When?" he asked. "Before the deal closed," she said simply. She placed a bet, pushed the chips forward with one finger. "I chose not to intervene." The words fell on the table like stones. Chose not to intervene. She had known. She had the information that would have changed the entire shape of the negotiation, and she had held it, and she had watched him proceed without it, and she had let him pay 15% more than he needed to, for a deal he thought represented the height of his professional capability, and she had let him celebrate it. "Why?" he said, and his voice had gone to a place it had not been all evening quiet, stripped without any of its usual architecture. Eleanor looked at him with those dark, steady eyes. "Because I wanted to see what you would do with incomplete information," she said. "You always believed you were the smartest person in any room. I wanted to understand whether that was something you had earned or something you had simply been allowed." The silence around the table was total. "And?" he asked. And she said, "The answer was more complicated than I expected." She paused. "You are genuinely intelligent, Ethan. I've never thought otherwise. But intelligence without humility moves in circles. It solves the problems it can see and walks straight into the ones it can't." Senator Hargrove, who had been very carefully studying his cards during this exchange, quietly folded his hand and reached for his drink. Ethan looked down at his chips. He had been holding a strong hand, 2 pairs king high. He pushed it all forward. "All in," he said. Everyone at the table looked at him. Eleanor looked at her cards, back at him. Then she smiled, the first real, unguarded smile he had seen from her all evening, brief as a flash of light. "Interesting," she said quietly. She called. He laid down his cards, 2 pairs, kings and tens. She laid down hers, 3 queens. The chips moved to her side of the table, and Ethan sat back in his chair and felt something in him, some final stubborn structure that had been holding since the moment he walked through the palace gates, give way. He was out, financially from the game, and in every other sense that mattered from something much larger. Gerald Ashton dealt the next hand without comment. Diana Cho poured herself a second glass of water. The senator rearranged his chips, and Eleanor stacked hers with that same unhurried precision she brought to everything. "You can stay if you like," she said to Ethan, not unkindly. "You're welcome at this table even without chips in the game." "Why would I stay?" "Because the conversation isn't finished," she said. "And because I think you already know that." He stayed. He didn't pick up any more cards. He simply sat with his empty side of the table and his glass of scotch and listened as the game continued, and the conversation moved through territory he had never been inside before, the actual architecture of power, the real relationships between money and obligation and responsibility and legacy. These people did not talk about wealth as accumulation. They talked about it as stewardship, as obligation, as something that carried weight rather than something that conferred ease. It was completely unlike any conversation he had ever been a part of. At 1:15 in the morning, he said to no one in particular, to the room in general, "I never knew she came from this." Marcus, who had entered quietly an hour earlier and positioned himself near the bar cart, spoke without turning around. "She never told you?" "No." "Did you ask?" Marcus said. "About her family, her history, where she came from?" Ethan thought about it. Genuinely tried to remember. The years of their marriage, the dinners, the mornings, the evenings when she would come home from the library with ink-stained fingers, and the particular quiet happiness of someone who had done good work. And he would be somewhere else in the apartment on his phone or his laptop already, and the next thing already past the present moment. "I asked in the beginning," he said slowly. "Early on, she said her family was private. And you accepted that?" "Yes." "Without curiosity?" He closed his eyes briefly. "Yes." Marcus was quiet. Then, "Eleanor is a woman who rewards curiosity," he said simply. "She always has been." Diana Cho looked up from her cards and addressed Ethan directly for the first time. "Mr. Carter, I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that I'm asking as the Trust's legal counsel, which means this conversation has a specific context." She waited for his nod. "Do you intend to continue in your current position at the company?" The directness of it cleared the air in the room like a window thrown open. "That depends," Ethan said, "on whether I still have one." "You do," Eleanor said. She had been looking at her cards. She did not look up. "I told you that is not what tonight is about." "Then what is tonight about?" Now she looked up. "Tonight," she said, is about you understanding fully without any remaining room for revision the true shape of your life. Not the story you've been telling, the actual shape. She held his gaze. Because a man who doesn't know the true shape of his life makes decisions based on a map that doesn't match the territory. And that, she placed a final bet, pushed her chips forward, is dangerous for him and for everyone around him. Ethan sat with that. He sat with it while the hand played out, while Gerald Ashton won the pot with a flush and made a small sound of satisfaction, while Senator Hargrove checked his watch and announced he needed to make a call. He sat with it while the room began to empty gradually, naturally, the way all rooms eventually empty. He sat with it until only he and Eleanor remained. And by then it was nearly 2 a.m, and outside the palace windows the December cold had deepened, and somewhere in the main ballroom the orchestra had finally gone quiet, and the night had moved into that particular still hour, when everything that has been held is finally unavoidably set down. Eleanor gathered the remaining cards without hurry. She squared them into a neat deck. She set them on the table. She looked at Ethan Carter across the empty chairs and the scattered chips and everything that had happened between them over the course of one long, devastating, illuminating evening. And she said, "Do you want to know the hardest part?" He looked at her. "Yes. The hardest part," she said quietly, "was not the divorce. It was not the things you said. It was not even watching you arrive tonight with her on your arm looking like you had won something." She paused. "The hardest part was knowing the entire time that you were capable of being someone extraordinary, and choosing every single day to be someone ordinary instead, and calling it ambition." The words moved through him like something physical. He had no answer. For the first time in his adult life, Ethan Carter sat in a room with a person who knew him actually completely, without flattery or illusion knew him, and he had absolutely nothing to say. And Eleanor, with the grace of someone who understood that silence was sometimes the most honest response a person could give, did not fill it. She simply let it be. The silence in that poker room lasted long enough to become something with weight and texture. Ethan sat across from Eleanor with his empty side of the table and his empty hands and the specific hollowness of a man who has just watched the last version of his own story collapse, and he understood with the particular clarity that only arrives at 2 a.m. after a long evening of controlled demolition that he had 2 choices. He could stand up, find Savannah, collect whatever remained of his dignity, and leave. Or he could stay in the chair and find out what was on the other side of the most honest conversation he had ever had in his life. He stayed in the chair. Eleanor watched him make that choice and said nothing. She waited. That was what she had always done. Waited with a patience that he had once called passivity and now recognized as something else entirely. It was not passivity. It was the discipline of someone who understood that the most important things could not be rushed, only prepared for. "I need to ask you something," he said finally. "All right. The investments, the trust, the acquisition information you withheld." He looked at his hands on the table. Was any of it about hurting me?" Eleanor considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She did not answer immediately, which told him she was giving him a real answer rather than a comfortable one. "No," she said. "Not in the way you mean. I didn't do any of it to cause you pain." She paused. "I did it because I was paying attention. Because that is what I have always done with things I care about, even things I have already lost." "You still cared, after everything." "Caring is not a faucet, Ethan. You don't turn it off because it becomes inconvenient." She folded her hands on the table. "What I stopped was hoping. Those are very different things." He absorbed that, let it settle. "I should go find Savannah," he said without moving. "Probably," Eleanor agreed, also without moving. Neither of them moved for another 30 seconds. Then Ethan said, and it came out rougher than he intended, "Did you know she was wrong for me, from the beginning?" Eleanor looked at him steadily. "I don't think that's the right question." "What's the right question?" "Whether you knew," she said simply, "whether some part of you understood what you were choosing and chose it anyway because she reflected something you wanted to believe about yourself." The accuracy of it was almost physical. He felt it the way you feel a correct diagnosis. The strange relief of someone finally naming, what has been wrong for a long time, mixed with the dread of understanding what the treatment will require. He stood up. His legs were steadier than he expected. He straightened his jacket, a reflex, a reassembly of surfaces. "Eleanor," he said. She looked up at him. "I'm sorry," he said. "For the things I said, for the way I left, for—" He stopped, started again. "For not being curious enough to know who you were." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Her expression did not shift dramatically. It was not a movie moment. It was quieter than that, and because of its quietness, more real. "I know," she said. "I could hear it in your voice when you said my name tonight. The first time at the bar." She paused. "That's enough, Ethan. It really is." He nodded, walked to the door. His hand was on the handle when she said quietly, "The courtyard, behind the east wing, if you need air that isn't crowded." He looked back. She had already returned her gaze to the card deck, squaring it, aligning its edges, with the same careful attention she brought to every damaged thing she had ever tried to restore. He walked out. The main ballroom, when he passed through it, was emptying. The orchestra had packed up. Staff moved through the space with the efficient quiet of people who did this routinely, collecting glasses, folding linens, returning the room to its pre-celebration state with practiced invisibility. A few guests remained in small clusters near the exit's coats on finishing conversations. He found Savannah near the entrance hall. She was sitting on a bench against the wall, her shoes off held in one hand, heels dangling, and she was looking at her phone with a particular expression he had never seen on her face before. Not the performative focus she wore when she was crafting a post, something more private, more uncertain. She looked up when she heard him coming. "I've been out here for 40 minutes, she said. "I know, I'm sorry." "Who were you with?" "Eleanor and some others." She nodded slowly, looked back at her phone, then held it up so he could see the screen. "Margot Delacroix published something," she said, 20 minutes ago." He took the phone. "The Continental Review's website, a piece titled with elegant restraint, 'An Evening at Ashford, What Old Money is Trying to Tell New Ambition.'" It was not a gossip piece. It was sharper than that, a cultural observation carefully written that described the evening's dynamic in terms that were precise without being cruel. It named no one directly. It didn't need to. Anyone who had been in the room would know exactly who the unnamed Wall Street executive was, and exactly who the Queen was, and exactly what had happened between them in the space of one December evening. The piece had been shared 400 times in 20 minutes. Ethan handed the phone back, sat down on the bench beside her, close but not touching. They both looked at the middle distance for a moment. "It's going to be picked up," Savannah said. "By morning, it'll be everywhere." "Probably." "Our names are going to come out." "Yes." She was quiet. Then, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Not the version of honest where you tell me what you think I want to hear, and then tell yourself you were being kind." Her voice was flat and tired in a way he had never heard from her before. "Actually honest." "All right." She turned to look at him. In the entrance hall light, with her shoes off and her hair beginning to come loose from its elaborate pinning, she looked suddenly younger than 24, and older at the same time. "Did you bring me here tonight as a shield?" she asked. "So that you would look like you had moved on, so that she could see you had moved on?" The question landed like a needle finding the exact right vein. He wanted to say no. He constructed the no in his mind, felt its shape, understood how he could deliver it with enough sincerity to be believed. He had done that particular thing 1,000 times, constructed an acceptable version of a difficult truth, and offered it in place of the actual one. He looked at Savannah's face, at the direct, exhausted honesty of her eyes in that moment. "Not consciously," he said. "But maybe, yes, some part of it, yes." She inhaled, looked away, her jaw tightened, held. "Okay," she said. Just that. "Okay," the single word carrying the weight of someone who had suspected something and now had it confirmed and was deciding what to do with the confirmation. "Savannah, don't." She held up one hand. "Just give me a minute." He gave her the minute. Outside, through the tall entrance hall windows, the December dark was total. The kind of dark that only happens in the early hours before dawn begins to threaten the horizon when the night is at its most complete. "I'm 24 years old," she said finally to the window. "I know people think that means I don't understand things, that I'm decorative, that I post pretty pictures, and I don't think about anything that matters." She paused. "I understand more than people give me credit for. I understood tonight, walking into this room, that I was in a situation I had not been told the truth about." Her voice did not waver. "I just couldn't figure out which direction the untruth was coming from." "I should have told you," he said, "about Eleanor, before tonight." "Yes." A pause. "What would you have told me?" "That we were married, that it ended badly, that—" He stopped. "That I wasn't good to her." Savannah turned to look at him again. "She was good to you, though." It was not a question. "Yes," he said. "She was." Savannah put her shoes back on, both of them methodically strapping the small buckles with steady fingers. She stood up and smoothed her dress and picked up her clutch from the bench beside her. She looked like herself again, pulled together, composed. But something was different. Some decision had been made in the last 10 minutes that changed the specific quality of the air between them. "I need to go home," she said. "Alone." He stood. "Savannah." "I'm not breaking up with you in a palace at 2 a.m, she said, with a short, humorless sound that was almost a laugh. I'm not doing that, but I need to go home and think, and you need to—" She looked at him with something that was not quite pity and not quite affection, but held traces of both. "You need to figure out what you actually want, not what looks right, not what performs well, what you actually want." She walked to the entrance. An attendant appeared immediately with her coat. She put it on. She turned back once. "She's remarkable, you know," Savannah said. "Eleanor. I hated her for about 40 minutes tonight, which I think is fair, but she's remarkable." She paused. "You should have paid more attention." She walked out. The doors closed behind her. Ethan stood alone in the entrance hall of the Ashford estate and thought about what he actually wanted. He stood there for a full 2 minutes doing that and found that the answer was more elusive than it had ever been, which was either a beginning or an ending, depending on how you looked at it. He found the courtyard by following the cold. There was a set of glass doors at the end of a corridor off the east wing that opened onto a stone courtyard, and when he pushed them open, the night air hit him like a wall. Not unpleasant, clean, and sharp with winter, the kind of cold that wakes you up in exactly the way you sometimes need to be woken. Snow had fallen earlier in the evening, and it lay undisturbed on the stone benches and along the tops of the low hedges that bordered the space, white and precise, every edge clean. He was not alone. Eleanor was standing near the center of the courtyard, still in her dark dinner dress, a coat thrown over her shoulders, looking up at the sky with the calm of someone completely accustomed to being comfortable in the cold. She turned when she heard him. "I thought you might come," she said. "You recommended it." "I did." She looked back up briefly. "The stars are clear tonight. The cold usually means clear." He walked toward her and stopped a few feet away. They stood in the courtyard in the dark, and the cold and the absolute quiet of a night fully committed to its own stillness. "Savannah left," he said. "I know. I saw her car leave." We didn't end things. She just needed to think." "That sounds like wisdom on her part," Eleanor said. No edge in it. She meant it. "She said you were remarkable." Eleanor smiled slightly. "I like her," she said, "more than I expected to. She's sharper than you gave her credit for." "A lot of people are sharper than I give them credit for." "Yes, simply, without cruelty." He stuffed his hands in his jacket pockets because he needed to do something with them. The cold was settling into his fingers. "You forgive people a lot," he said. "Easily." "Not easily," she corrected. "Deliberately. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Easy forgiveness doesn't cost anything. Deliberate forgiveness is a choice you make even when part of you doesn't want to. It's harder. It takes longer." She paused. "But it leaves you lighter." He looked at her profile in the dark, the particular stillness of her face. "Do you forgive me?" She turned to look at him. In the winter dark, without the palace lights, her face was quieter than it had been all evening, less composed in the way that things are less composed when they are more true. "I forgave you a long time ago," she said. "That's not what tonight was about." "Then what was tonight about?" She was quiet for a moment, a long one, the kind that meant she was deciding whether the real answer was something she wanted to give. "Tonight was about me," she said finally, "not you." She turned back to the sky. "I needed to see you here, in my world, on my terms, not because I wanted to humiliate you. I meant what I said in the ballroom that was not about humiliation, but because for 3 years I have existed in your version of events. The woman you left, the librarian who couldn't keep up. And I needed just once in a room full of people who know who I am to be seen clearly, to have the real story visible." She paused. "Does that make sense?" "Yes," he said. And it did, completely. The clarity of it was almost painful. "The speech in the ballroom," he said. "Were you afraid to give it?" She thought about it. "A little, not because of the room, because of you, because I didn't know if hearing it would change anything for you, and I—" She stopped. "You wanted it to," he said quietly. She didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. "I wanted you to understand," she said finally, "that what we had was real, that what I gave you was real, that it mattered not because I need you to validate it, but because—" She exhaled slowly, "because it was the realest thing I've ever done. Loving you, even when you made it very hard." Ethan stood in the snow-edged courtyard at 2:30 in the morning and felt the truth of that move through him like current through wire. He had been loved completely. He had not known it while it was happening. He had misidentified it as smallness, when it was in fact the largest thing anyone had ever offered him. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to be honest with me the way you've been honest all night." "All right. Is there any—" He stopped, rearranged. "If things were different, if tonight had been different, if I were—" He could not finish the sentence. It was too large and too fragile at the same time. Eleanor looked at him with an expression that was tender and clear and entirely without ambiguity. "No," she said gently, "and I think you know that, and I think part of you is relieved, even if another part of you is not." He exhaled, a long, slow exhale that carried something with it, some remaining hope, some surviving fantasy, some version of the story where tonight ended differently. He let it go into the cold air and watched it disappear. "What happens to the company?" he said when he could speak again. "Nothing changes tomorrow. You go to work. You do your job. The board will continue as it has." She paused. "What changes is you, hopefully. And if it doesn't, then at some point decisions will be made by people who have the full picture," she said simply. "But I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think you are more capable of genuine change than you have ever allowed yourself to be. Because change requires admitting you were wrong, and that has always been the thing you found hardest." He looked at her. "You know me very well." "I paid attention," she said. "For 7 years. I paid very close attention." She pulled her coat tighter against a gust of wind. "That is what I do with the things I love. I pay attention until I understand them." They stood in silence for a while. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind of silence that two people can only share if they once knew each other very well and are standing now on the far side of something irrevocable, finding that the territory there is stranger and more habitable than either of them expected. "I should go in," Eleanor said. "It's late." "Eleanor." He said her name one more time. She stopped, turned, waited. "Thank you," he said, "for tonight. I know it sounds inadequate." She looked at him for a long moment, then something in her face softened just slightly, just briefly, the way a lamp briefly brightens before it steadies. "Go home, Ethan," she said, not unkindly, the opposite of unkindly, the way you say, go home to someone you once loved and do not hate and have finally fully, completely let go. Sleep. And in the morning start making decisions based on who you actually are, instead of who you've been pretending to be. She walked back toward the glass doors. He stood in the courtyard and watched her go. The door opened. The warm light from inside spilled briefly across the snow, and then it closed again, and Eleanor was gone, and Ethan was alone in the cold December dark with the stars above him and the city somewhere beyond the walls and the full, unmediated weight of his actual life settling around his shoulders like something he was only now strong enough to carry. He stood there for another 10 minutes, maybe more. He was thinking about his father, the electrician from Cleveland who had never pretended to be anything other than what he was, and who had been Ethan now understood with a clarity that arrived too late and was therefore twice as sharp one of the most dignified men he had ever known. He was thinking about the apartment in Boston that had smelled of books and paste and Eleanor's jasmine tea. He was thinking about the morning he had signed the divorce papers and walked out of the lawyer's office feeling lighter and understood only now that what he had mistaken for freedom was actually the specific lightness of a man who has just put down something irreplaceable without recognizing its weight. He was thinking about what Marcus had said in the corridor, that Eleanor rewarded curiosity, that he had never been curious enough. He was thinking about Savannah's face on the bench putting her shoes back on with steady hands and telling him to figure out what he actually wanted. He was thinking finally about the question she had asked him that he had answered incompletely. Did he love Eleanor? The full answer, the real one, was not the one he had given. The full answer was yes. He had loved her. Imperfectly selfishly, without the patience or the attention or the humility that love required to be anything other than a word. But he had loved her. And he had left her, not because he stopped, but because loving her required him to be someone better than he knew how to be, and it was easier to call her boring than to call himself insufficient. That was the true shape of it. That was the map that matched the territory. He finally turned and walked back toward the palace doors. His hands were numb. His chest felt scoured raw and clean, the way things are clean after something difficult has passed through them and taken the residue with it. Inside, the last staff members moved through the entrance hall. One of them offered him his coat. He put it on. He called a car. While he waited, he took out his phone, looked at it. He had 14 notifications, missed calls from numbers he didn't immediately recognize. A text from his board chairman that said, "Only call me tomorrow morning." 2 voicemails from numbers he associated with journalists, and a message from Savannah that contained 4 words. "I'm home. I'm okay." He typed back, "Good, we'll talk soon." He meant it. He put the phone away. The car arrived. He walked out of the Ashford estate into the December night and did not look back at the palace, not because he was indifferent to it, but because looking back would not change anything, and he was beginning to understand for the first time in his life that forward was the only direction that mattered. Not forward, the way he had always moved forward aggressively, acquisitively, collecting proof of progress like a man filling a room with furniture he never sits in. But forward the way Eleanor moved through a room, without urgency, without performance, with the quiet, anchored confidence of someone who knows exactly where they stand. He had a lot of work to do. The car moved through the dark streets of Washington toward the hotel. The city passed by the windows lit and vast and indifferent, the way cities always are at 3 a.m, when the people awake in them are the ones who have just come from something that changed them. Ethan Carter rode through it in silence and thought for the very first time not about what he wanted to have, but about who he wanted to be. He did not sleep that night. He lay in the hotel room with his jacket still on and stared at the ceiling and let the evening move through him the way a fever moves in waves in heat, in images that arrived without sequence or mercy. Eleanor at the top of the staircase, the sound of 500 people going quiet when she entered a room, the poker chips moving across the table to her side, Savannah on the bench with her shoes off, putting them back on with steady hands and telling him to figure out what he actually wanted. Eleanor in the courtyard, the snow on the hedges, go home, Ethan, and in the morning start making decisions based on who you actually are instead of who you've been pretending to be. He was still awake at 5:30 when the city outside his window began its reluctant return to gray morning light. He got up, showered, put on clothes that were not a tuxedo, sat at the small desk by the window with a cup of coffee he had made badly from the machine on the dresser, and opened his laptop. The Continental Review piece had been picked up by 4 major outlets overnight. He read each version of the story in sequence with the particular detachment of a man reading his own autopsy. None of them named him. The piece was too well crafted for that Margot Delacroix had written something that was simultaneously specific enough to be devastating and general enough to be undeniable. The unnamed executive, the ex-wife who turned out to be someone extraordinary, the gala that became a reckoning. By 6 in the morning, it had been shared 11,000 times. The comments were what finished him, not the cruel ones he had been braced for those. It was the other kind. The ones from people who recognized themselves in the story, from women who had been called ordinary by men who weren't half as substantial as they believed themselves to be, from men in their 50s and 60s who wrote with the specific grammar of hard-earned regret that they had been that executive once, and that the bill always eventually arrived, and that when it did, you had better hope you still had enough left of yourself to pay it. He read those comments for 40 minutes. Then he called his board chairman. Richard Calloway picked up on the second ring, which meant he had been awake too. Richard was 67 and had been in finance since before Ethan was born, and had the particular steadiness of someone who had seen every variety of crisis and classified them all as manageable. "I assume you've seen the coverage," Ethan said. "Since about 3 this morning," Richard said. "I've had 4 calls, 2 from board members, 1 from our PR firm, and 1 from a journalist who identified herself as being from a different publication than the one that ran the piece. What do you need from me?" A pause. Richard did not rush his pauses. "What I need," he said carefully, "is to understand the full picture, not the version you would have given me last week, the full picture." Ethan exhaled, looked at the gray morning outside his window, and then he told Richard everything: the investments, the acquisition information, the controlling stake, Eleanor's ownership of the company for the past 14 months, all of it in the flat, sequential way that you deliver information you can no longer afford to manage. Richard was silent for a long time after. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that the woman who owns this company is your ex-wife?" "Yes." "And that you did not know this until last night?" "Correct." "And that her trust's investments have been supporting the company's performance for multiple years?" "Yes." Another silence. Longer this time. "Ethan," Richard's voice shifted, not angry, which would have been easier to receive, but something quieter and more serious. "Do you understand what this means for how we need to reconsider the last several years of decision-making?" "Yes," he said. "I do." "Good." A pause. "Come back to New York. We'll meet Monday morning. Bring nothing that spins this. Just bring what's true." He hung up. Ethan set the phone down on the desk and finished his terrible coffee, and understood that Monday morning was going to be one of the most difficult professional conversations of his life. Not because Richard would destroy him. Richard was not that kind of man. But because the conversation would require him to sit in a room with people he had led and acknowledge with precision and without excuse, the ways in which his leadership had operated on foundations he hadn't built and didn't fully understand. That was going to cost something. It was supposed to. He packed his bag, checked out, took a car to the station. On the train back to New York, he called Savannah. She answered after 3 rings. Her voice was careful, not cold, but careful the way you speak to someone when you are still deciding what kind of conversation you are willing to have. "How are you?" he asked. "I've been better," she said. "I've also been worse. This is somewhere in the middle." A pause. "How are you?" Honest answer. "Please." "I'm recalibrating," he said. It was the most accurate word he had. "Everything I thought I understood about the last several years is different than it was." "Because of what she told you?" "Because of what the whole night told me." He looked out the train window at the winter landscape moving past. "I owe you an apology, Savannah. A real one." "I know," she said, not accepting it yet, just acknowledging that it existed. "I used you," he said. "Not intentionally, not consciously, but I built something with you that was more about what I wanted to look like than about who you actually were. And you deserved better than that. You deserved someone who was paying attention to you specifically, not to the image of a life you represented." Silence on the line, long enough that he thought the call might have dropped. she said finally, is the most honest thing you have ever said to me. I know. It's also, she made a small sound, complicated, not quite a laugh and not quite a cry. It's also kind of devastating, Ethan. I know that too. She was quiet for a moment. I watched her speech last night about 8 more times after I got home, she said. Eleanor's, the one in the ballroom. Someone filmed it. 3 people filmed it. It's been shared 40,000 times as of an hour ago. A pause. She's extraordinary, the way she said it. Without anger, just truth. Complete truth delivered like she had nothing to prove. He heard Savannah exhale. I want to be like that someday, that sure of myself, that comfortable with what's real. You're closer to it than you think, he said, and meant it. Another silence warmer than the previous ones. We're not right for each other, Savannah said. Not a question, not an accusation, just a fact stated with the clarity of someone who has sat up most of the night arriving at it. I think I knew that before last night. You were so certain about everything. And when someone is that certain, it's easy to mistake their certainty for wisdom. It wasn't wisdom, he said. It was noise. Yeah, she paused. It was. They stayed on the line together for another minute without speaking, which was its own kind of closure. The comfortable silence of 2 people who are not enemies, who were never enemies, who simply chose each other at the wrong time for the wrong reasons, and are now with more grace than the situation required choosing to let go. Take care of yourself, she said finally. You too, he said. Savannah, you're going to be fine, more than fine. I know, she said, and from the way she said it direct without performance with the specific confidence of someone who is only beginning to discover how true it is, he believed her completely. The call ended. He put the phone in his jacket pocket and watched New Jersey pass by the window and thought about the strange mercy of honest endings. The story broke completely on Monday. Not the Continental Review piece that had been the elegant opening act. What broke on Monday was a financial publication that had done its own reporting, had obtained documentation of the trust's investment history, and had run a piece that was considerably less literary and considerably more specific. The headline was direct: Ashford Royal Trust revealed as controlling stakeholder in Carter Webb Financial, CEO unaware for 14 months. By 10 Monday morning, Ethan's phone had received 62 calls. He answered the bored ones. He let the journalists go to voicemail. He walked into Richard Calloway's office at 9 sharp and sat down and did exactly what he had promised Richard he would do, brought what was true and nothing that spun it. The meeting lasted 3 hours. At the end of it, Richard leaned back in his chair and looked at Ethan with the expression of a man who had made a decision and was now delivering it. You're not being removed, Richard said. I want to be clear about that. What happened here was not malfeasance on your part. You didn't know. And the company has genuinely performed well. Some of that is the trust's investment, yes, but not all of it. You built real things here, Ethan. The foundation was more supported than you knew, but the structure you put up on it was yours. Ethan nodded. He did not feel relieved exactly. He felt the specific, complicated feeling of being evaluated accurately, which is different from being evaluated kindly and more valuable than either. What changes, Richard continued, is your relationship with the trust. You will need to have a direct conversation with their representatives, with Eleanor, or with whoever she designates, and establish a transparent operating relationship going forward. No more, he searched for the word, invisible architecture. Agreed, Ethan said, and you'll need to be honest with the team, not a press release, an actual conversation in the room with the people who have been working for you. Richard looked at him steadily. They deserve to understand the full picture. I know, Ethan said. I'll do it this week. Richard nodded, picked up his pen. The meeting was over. Ethan walked out into the corridor and stood there for 30 seconds with his eyes closed. When he opened them, his assistant was waiting with a list of calls to return and a calendar full of meetings that suddenly looked entirely different from how they had looked 1 week ago. Clear the afternoon, he said. I need to think. He spent the afternoon doing something he had not done in years. He walked. Not purposefully, not toward anything, just through the city, through the particular cold of a New York December afternoon, through blocks he had walked 100 times without seeing them. He walked past a used bookshop and stopped outside it for a full minute, looking through the window at the shelves inside, and thought about Eleanor's library, and about a woman whose hands knew how to make damaged things whole again, and about what it meant to pay attention to something until you understood it. He went inside. He bought 3 books. He had no particular idea why those 3. He carried them home in a paper bag and set them on his kitchen counter and stood there looking at them for a long time. His apartment felt different since he had come back from Washington. Not physically different, same furniture, same windows, same everything. But different the way a room feels different when you understand for the first time how you've been living in it. He had furnished this place for an audience. Every object in it had been chosen to communicate something. Even the books on his shelves, which he had curated, he admitted to himself now with his eyes closed, more for the image they projected than for any deep relationship to the words inside them. The 3 books from the used shop were worn, soft-spined, marked by previous readers. They had lived in someone else's hands before his. He put them on the shelf and felt obscurely like he had started something. 3 weeks after the Gala, Eleanor's office contacted his, not Eleanor directly, a woman named Claire who introduced herself as Eleanor's executive coordinator and who spoke with the precise, pleasant efficiency of someone who managed an enormous amount of moving parts and experienced no stress about any of them. She requested a meeting, a working one, the trust the company the path forward. She offered a date in January. He accepted. He spent the 2 weeks before the meeting preparing in a way he had never prepared for anything before. Not performance preparation, not the construction of talking points and position narratives and strategic impressions, actual preparation. He read every document. He talked to every relevant person. He sat with his own numbers and his own decisions with the specific rigor of someone who is no longer trying to be right, but is genuinely trying to understand. On the morning of the meeting, he arrived at the Trust's offices understated, in a building that did not announce its importance and was shown into a conference room. Claire offered coffee. He accepted. He sat down. Eleanor arrived 7 minutes later. Coat-off sleeves rolled to the elbow, reading glasses pushed up on her head, a tablet in one hand, and a cup of tea in the other. She looked like she was in the middle of a working day. She looked more than she had at the Gala, like herself, the Eleanor he had known in the quiet mornings in their Boston apartment, present and focused and entirely without pretense. She sat down across from him. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. They looked at each other across the conference table. No ballroom, no orchestra, no audience of 500, just the 2 of them and a stack of documents and the clear winter light coming through the windows. "How have you been?" she asked, and it was not a formal question. It was the genuine one. Honest answer. The corner of her mouth moved. "Always." "Changed," he said, still figuring out what that means exactly, but genuinely changed. She studied him. That careful, attentive gaze that he now understood had always been seeing him more clearly than he ever saw himself. "I believe you," she said, and then she opened the tablet and pushed a document across the table and said, "Let's work." They worked for 4 hours. It was the most productive 4 hours of his professional life. Not because of the content, though, the content was substantial, but because of the quality of it, the specific texture of a conversation between 2 people who are not performing anything and therefore have access to the full range of what they actually know. Eleanor's mind across a table and a set of spreadsheets was extraordinary in a way that the Gala had only gestured at. She thought in structures. She identified weakness with the precision of someone who had spent her life looking at damaged things and understanding exactly where the damage was before she decided how to repair it. He had been in her vicinity for 7 years and had fundamentally failed to understand what he was in the presence of. He understood it now. At the end of the meeting, when Claire had come to collect the signed documents and Eleanor was gathering her things, Ethan said, "I want you to know that what I said in the courtyard, that I'm sorry I meant every word of it. And I want you to know that everything that's happened since that night it's been because of what you gave me. The truth. I know you didn't give it for my benefit, but I benefited from it." Eleanor paused, looked at him over the stack of papers she was collecting. Her expression was composed but not closed, open in the specific way that things are open when they have been through fire and emerged without bitterness. "I know," she said. "I can see it. The difference." She paused. "I'm glad, Ethan. I genuinely am." "I know you are," he said. "That's what makes you who you are." She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. She walked to the door, stopped, turned back one final time. "There's a literacy program the trust funds," she said, "in Chicago and 3 other cities. We're expanding it next year. It teaches adults to read people who fell through every crack in every system for decades." She looked at him steadily. "We need a corporate partner, someone with operational capacity and genuine commitment, not a vanity sponsorship, real work." She held his gaze. "I thought of you." He stared at her. "Why?" "Because you grew up without enough," she said simply, "and the best things people do are usually connected to what they lacked." She picked up her coat. "Think about it, no pressure. Claire has the materials." She walked out. He sat alone in the conference room for 5 minutes after she left. The winter light had shifted lower now, late afternoon gold. He looked at the materials Claire had left behind, the program description, the reach, the faces in the photographs, adults middle-aged and older, sitting at tables with books open in front of them, wearing expressions he recognized. The expression of someone who has been given access to something they were always supposed to have. He picked up the folder. He took it home. He read every page of it that night. 2 years later, Ethan Carter lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Chicago's Lincoln Square neighborhood. It was smaller than his New York penthouse by a significant margin. It had a kitchen with a window that looked out onto a courtyard and a bookshelf that was genuinely disorganizingly full of books he had actually read. He had taken the corporate partnership with the literacy program, not as a vanity project, not as a rehabilitation strategy, as actual work. He had restructured his professional role to give it enough hours to matter. He drove to the program's centers 2 mornings a week and sat in rooms with adults who were learning what most people took for granted, and he helped in whatever small, concrete ways he could. He was not happy in the loud, performed way he had once pursued happiness. He was something quieter and more durable than that, something that held. He had not found what he would call love again, not yet. He had dated 2 women briefly, both of them kind, both of them real in the way he had only recently learned to recognize and value. Neither of them had developed into more. He did not force it. He was learning slowly that patience was not weakness, that being still was not the same as being lost. Savannah had built something remarkable. She had pivoted not overnight, not without stumbling from lifestyle content to a platform about authenticity and self-knowledge and the specific courage it takes to stop performing and start living. She had 4 times the followers she had before. She occasionally posted about a night in Washington that had changed her without naming names or details, and those posts were always the ones that reached furthest. She and Ethan had coffee once in New York 8 months after the gala. It was easy and honest, and they parted as people who genuinely wished each other well and had no interest in revisiting anything that had passed between them. That was clean. He was grateful for it. Eleanor appeared on the cover of a national magazine in the spring of the 2nd year. The story inside was a long profile, the first she had ever agreed to. She spoke about the Ashford legacy, about stewardship, about the difference between power that serves itself and power that serves something larger. She spoke about the literacy program's expansion. She did not mention Ethan. She did not mention the gala. She did not need to. He bought the magazine, kept it, not on display, in the drawer of his nightstand where he kept things that mattered. There was one sentence in the profile that he had read so many times he no longer needed the page to find it. The journalist had asked Eleanor what she believed was the truest measure of a person's character. And Eleanor had said, in the way she said everything quietly without need for effect, whether they can be changed by the truth. Not everyone can. Some people hear the truth and build higher walls, but some people hear it and finally open a window. He had been that second kind of person, just barely, just in time, just enough. He did not know if that was enough to make him a good man. He thought it might be the beginning of one. He was 43 years old, and he was starting over in the most real sense, not reinventing his image, not constructing a new performance, but actually humbly, one honest day at a time, becoming someone worth being. He sat at the kitchen table one morning in January, 3 years after the gala, with the window light coming through and a cup of coffee he had made properly this time, and one of the worn, soft-spined books from the used shop open in front of him. Outside, the city was already moving. He could hear it. He thought about his father, the electrician from Cleveland, the man who had fixed things with his hands and never once pretended to be more than he was, and who had been in every way that Ethan now understood to matter the richest man he had ever known. He thought about Eleanor, not with longing, not with regret, with the specific, clear gratitude of someone who understands that the most important lessons of their life were taught by someone who owed them nothing and gave them everything anyway. She had not saved him. She had not tried to. She had simply told him the truth precisely, completely, in a room full of people who could witness it. And then she had walked back into her own extraordinary life and left him to decide what to do with what she'd given him. He had decided. Every morning since he had been deciding again. That was the whole of it. That was the work. Not a single dramatic transformation, not a climactic moment of redemption, but the small, daily, unglamorous choice to be honest with himself, with the people around him, with the distance between who he had been and who he was still slowly becoming. Some people spend their entire lives chasing the reflection of greatness in other people's eyes and never once look at themselves clearly enough to find the real thing. Ethan Carter had been that man. He was trying every day not to be anymore, and in the end, that was the only victory that actually counted, not the ones the world could see. The one that looked back at him every morning from his own mirror, quiet and honest, and finally unashamed.